The US has shaped the world around you. It has likely either protected you
Light them all up.
or bombed you, and influenced the rules of the global order we all live by. Now, Donald Trump is ripping up the playbook. In places like Venezuela, Greenland, Ukraine, and beyond. So, is this just chaos? Or is there a strategy behind it all?
We are going to run the country. We'll be hitting them very hard where it hurts. We are going to do something on Greenland, whether they like it or not.
The world is grappling to make sense of it all.
A world without rules.
当前国际形势变乱交织。
The New World Order.
New world orders don't just appear out of nowhere. They emerge after major ruptures, like World War II. When the United States rose as a superpower, it shaped a system of new rules to prevent another global conflict. Borders were meant to be respected, free trade encouraged, international institutions were set up to oversee it all. People later started calling it the rules-based order. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union challenged US power, militarily and ideologically. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the US went from superpower to hegemon, the most powerful player that called the shots in a brave new world.
A world where the rule of law supplants the rule of the jungle, a world in which nations recognize the shared responsibility for freedom and justice, a world where the strong respect the rights of the weak.
Of course, the US were the good guys.
And the world's greatest democracy will lead a whole world of democracies.
Shaping a balance of power that favors freedom.
To assure the rule of law and the rights of man.
Sure, this was often just lip service. The US ignored international law when it found it convenient, like when it invaded Iraq. Held suspects without charge or trial, and in other cases. Was the rules-based order ever a real thing?
Most of what people mean when they say rules-based international order is actually just this period of US sort of dominance since the end of the Cold War.
Emma Ashford is an analyst on US grand strategy.
American hegemony was in many ways much more liberal than what came before it, right? Open free trade, some norms around things like protection of civilians and human rights and democracy. The fundamental point to make here is that it was US power that enabled this period.
Enter Donald Trump, demanding others' territory, slapping on tariffs, and pulling the US out of international organizations.
What is this one? Withdrawing from the World Health Organization.
Ooh, that's a big one.
Is there anything that could stop you if you wanted to?
Yeah, there's one thing. My own morality, my own mind. It's the only thing that can stop. And that's
law.
very good. I don't need international law.
I think President Trump is destroying the order that made the United States and its allies safe and prosperous.
This is Kori Schake. She worked at the National Security Council under former Republican President George W. Bush.
No dominant power in history has had as much voluntary cooperation as the United States has gotten since 1945. And we get that voluntary cooperation because we don't behave in the way Donald Trump is behaving.
And many in his administration share the hostility to the international system.
The post-war global order is not just obsolete, it is now a weapon being used against us.
We live in a world in the real world, Jake, that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power.
America First, Peace Through Strength, brought to you by the War Department.
So, what's shaping such perceptions?
I think that the rules-based order, such as it was destroyed over the last 15 years by Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin.
Alexander Gray worked at the National Security Council in Donald Trump's first term.
It's become counterproductive to us to still operate as if the world is in the 1990s when it's not. And candidly, we're now reverting back to something that looks much more like earlier periods in world history. And I think the Trump administration is just trying to adapt to that.
And the US is flexing its muscles in the Western Hemisphere, as we saw in Venezuela. When US forces snatched Nicolas Maduro after months of military buildup in the Caribbean. Trump wants to dominate this part of the world. He spells it out in the National Security Strategy. That's a document every US president makes about their strategic objectives. Trump's is all about America first. Trump refers to the Monroe Doctrine, formulated 200 years ago by US President James Monroe. It was a message to European powers. We're in charge here, don't bother us. The US now says it sees similar threats today from China and Russia.
We have spent 25 years ignoring the hemisphere largely, and China and Russia have gained significant strategic, economic, and I would even argue dual-use or military leverage in the hemisphere. That is an area of special concern for us, and so we have to have a more proactive, I would argue, approach to addressing those threats.
I genuinely don't understand the Trump administration's obsession with bullying our neighbors in the Western Hemisphere. It seems to me incredibly self-defeating. We don't have major security challenges in the Western Hemisphere. The US won the geopolitical lottery.
And now Trump wants to cash in, from Venezuelan oil to Greenland's rare earth minerals. A grab for valuable resources. So Trump has got everyone talking about the Western Hemisphere. But look at this. This is where US airstrikes struck in Trump's first year back in office.
He's perfectly happy to use military force to achieve his goals. There's been this debate, I think common misconception in Washington and elsewhere, that Donald Trump is an isolationist, that he is wanting to pull the US back from the world. And that is just not accurate.
So it's about how Trump engages with the world.
You don't have the cards right now.
First off, with the US's friends.
You're gambling with World War III.
Or this about NATO allies.
We've never needed them. They'll say they sent some troops to Afghanistan or this or that. And they did. They stayed a little back, a little off the front lines.
And the US's friends are taking it badly.
I consider President Trump's remarks to be insulting and frankly appalling.
And Canada never, ever will be part of America.
Les États-Unis se détournent progressivement de certains de ses alliés.
So what does all this have to do with US strategy?
I think the big shift that we're seeing in US foreign policy is the result of this realization that the world is changing, that the US is no longer, so far out ahead of every other country in the world that we can't necessarily do everything anymore, and so we need to focus.
This focus concerns the US global military footprint. You see, these are the countries the US officially designates as major allies. And many of them host US military bases and facilities. US Congress says there are around 120 of them in the world. Independent experts count 750. Here are some of them. There is no complete public list. No other country has anything close. There are bases in some of the most remote and diverse locations you can imagine. This vast and controversial network allows the US to deploy forces rapidly almost anywhere. Plus, there are its aircraft carriers, kind of like floating bases. Strategically, this footprint is supposed to serve three main purposes. In Europe, deterring Russia. In East Asia, keeping China in check. And in the Middle East, staving off Iran. So, three potential flashpoints. But being ready for war in all three regions at the same time is extremely difficult, even for the United States. For example, just in January, when Iran cracked down on protests, Donald Trump threatened the country's leaders with strikes. But at the time, major vessels needed for the job were elsewhere. It took 10 days for this aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, to go from the South China Sea to the Persian Gulf.
So that's strategic overextension in practice. It's the notion that we had tried to do so much around the world that we don't actually have the military assets we need to do it. And unless we want to spend a lot more, build up a much larger military, we need to find a way to dial down what we're trying to do.
This brings us back to US allies. The US wants Europe to handle Russia and Gulf allies to deal with Iran so that the US can back away and focus on China instead.
Russia is not a medium-term threat, and it's not a long-term threat to the United States. To me, that is a local European problem that can be provided for with some US support.
From NATO's early years onwards, many US presidents have wanted European allies to spend more on defense. Now, Trump is one reason why they are paying up. But because he's putting the alliance itself in question.
If they don't pay, I'm not going to defend them.
For the first time in decades, Europeans are openly discussing whether the US would come to help in a crisis.
I think our NATO allies are completely justified in their worry, and it grieves me so much that my government is doing so much damage to that transatlantic link.
I think his determination is that Europe needs the United States more than the United States needs Europe.
Over in the Middle East, the US wants scenes like these to remain a thing of the past. The failures of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars made many Americans skeptical of foreign interventions.
Every president since Obama has tried to pull back from the Middle East and then sort of got pulled back in by some crisis.
Trump's latest standoff with Iran shows that leaving the region altogether is not that simple. So Trump is buying into some long-standing US strategy aims. What's different with Trump is that he doesn't necessarily support allies when he doesn't think there's anything in it for the US.
Alliances are America's superpower. They magnify our own strength, and they are the basis of our security and our prosperity. The Trump administration doesn't understand that. They're doing material damage to it.
I think alliances are not, they're not human beings. They're neither good nor bad. Alliances serve a purpose or they don't. So I think the president's simply changing the expectations about what does a good ally mean.
And he is changing other expectations too.
You want me to say really terrible things about Putin and then say, "Hi, Vladimir, how are we doing on the deal?" That doesn't work that way.
Donald Trump is engaging with America's foes.
One of the bigger shifts this administration has made, and the one that I think is actually very, very good for US statecraft, is their willingness to talk to anybody. We've gotten this habit of refusing to talk to bad actors around the world, because that would be seen as something bad, right? If we actually talk to Russia about what's happening in Ukraine, that's seen as giving something to the Russians. But that's not how great powers actually achieve their interests.
So that's great power diplomacy. But what about the interests of smaller countries, the ones that are actually on the sharp end of these deals?
I certainly think Russia has been emboldened by the radical shift in Trump's attitudes about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I mean, he's basically taking the Russian position against a free and democratic society fighting desperately for its sovereignty and its survival.
It's China that is now the priority for the US, the only country growing so fast that the US sees it as a threat to its own global dominance. Trump was the first president to call China a strategic competitor back in his first term. The US has been expanding its military footprint in the Indo-Pacific to deter China, for example, in the so-called First Island chain of US bases around Taiwan and the South China Sea. Trump has since dropped the tough talk and is mostly talking economics with Beijing.
But he's a very tough negotiator.
There are two ways to look at this approach to dealing with US foes. The first argues that Trump could be prepared to accept China's and Russia's neighborhoods as being their spheres of influence, where they can do as they wish, much like the one he wants for himself in the Western Hemisphere. The second view argues that Trump still wants to keep Beijing in check, and you need to read between the lines of his national security strategy.
It is the policy of the United States to prevent any one power from gaining hegemony in regional hegemony. Clearly, that is aimed at China, and the desire to keep a free and open Indo-Pacific, obviously directed at China. So, if you take the document in its totality, it is very much a document about U.S. priorities for dealing with a world in which China remains our paramount security threat.
In fact, the US is quietly continuing to expand its military footprint in the Indo-Pacific. Plans are underway to station US submarines in this naval base on Australia's west coast. So Trump says he will continue deterring China in the Indo-Pacific, even though he is pursuing his own sphere of influence closer to home.
The US feels that it has primacy in Latin America, and has done since the Monroe Doctrine. That's not the same thing as giving other states a sphere of influence. They're not, giving away the world, but they are focusing much more on what they see as our own sphere of influence. It's hypocritical, but that's great power politics.
So underneath all the chaos, there is a strategy. Donald Trump wants to control the Western Hemisphere, pull back from Europe and the Middle East, and contain China in the Indo-Pacific. And to achieve this, he's prepared to shake up the old world order, ditch alliances, and flout international law.
I don't need international law.
We could end here, but the story goes on. Some US allies are licking their wounds, trying to find a new direction by confronting their own hypocrisy.
We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false. This fiction was useful. And American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. And we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works.
Middle powers are now hedging their bets and reaching out to other players.
Everybody agrees unipolarity is ending, but they don't necessarily agree on what's coming next. I tend to think that we're looking at some kind of multipolar system, which is to say the US and China as very powerful states, but others as important.
So the global order is fragmenting. The US no longer calls the shots alone. It's drifting away from rules and values it once claimed to defend, and doubling down on military power. And the world we live in is about to get a lot more unpredictable.